If you are someone that's a little bit more sensitive and you might have the stuffy nose, postnasal drip, the itchy eyes, the swollen eyes, the brain fog, you may want to look at these foods. These foods may be exacerbating your histamine levels in general and potentially filling up that rain barrel of more mold. Hey everybody, welcome back. Great to have you here as always on the Cabral concept. This is our Total Wellness Tuesday, where we're going to be talking about mold today, mold toxicity, as well as certain foods, whether you've been diagnosed with a mold-based pathogen illness, or you're someone that's just dealing with a lot of the chronic potential mold issues, suffering from things like itchy eyes or postnasal drip, runny nose, stuffy nose, a little bit of swollen face or swollen eyes when you wake up in the morning. These are all things to look at. Now, those are more of the hidden base ones that can sometimes just be dismissed as maybe allergies or maybe it's a food sensitivity. And while that's absolutely true, it is possible that you've had some type of mold exposure. So my job is to share with you all of the potentials as to what your underlying root causes are. And if you haven't heard before, it's becoming more popular or just more well-known. It's been around now, in the natural health industry. People have been talking about it for 40, 50 years. But there's something called stealth pathogens. And what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go through all the stealth pathogens again here today, but I want to link up that episode. So we'll do that at stephencabral.com/2657. That's today's show notes. We'll link up that other previous podcast. And today I want to focus on one of those stealth pathogens, which is mold. We run a specific lab called the mycotoxins test, and we actually look for some of the waste, it's basically waste products, waste given off from mold inside of your body. And so someone might encounter mold. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown, a base of this, and then I have lots more podcasts on mold toxicity. But it's debilitating. People end up with headaches and brain fog and massive fatigue and fibromyalgia and inflammation, migraines, headaches, allergies, asthma, etc. But here's the thing. Mold is very common. It's 51% of all households in the UK and New England here in the US alone, damper-based climates, that have some type of mold-based damage in the home, whether it's an apartment, an office, your home, that you may not know about because it could be behind the drywall, it could be in the vents. We were very diligent about that when we were purchasing our new home, and we actually did mold-based testing in the garage, and we did mold-based testing in our house. And we wanted to be able to use both spaces. And so then we were able to actually look at the mold levels. Everybody has some because it's in the outside environment as well, but what the levels were. And it was important to us to do the mold test ahead of time to know if we were going to have to remediate or not. That means basically rip out drywall, rip out venting, to clean out the mold, because the mold is very difficult to get rid of. So we ended up having to do that in our garage. So we literally ripped out all of the ceiling and half of the walls. You always want to go at least 6 feet from where you find the mold, and a good mold remediator will be able to discuss more about that. I know it's a topic at our October event, the Reimagining Health Summit. We'll be certainly talking more about that, but it's vital that you find mold and that you get rid of it even before, if possible, then doing a mold wellness-based protocol. All right, so if you're worried about it, you think you may have it, you can get a low-level baseline test through the Candida Metabolic and Vitamins test. That's part of the Big Five. Or you can actually run a mycotoxins test. We can link up labs on the podcast. We can't link up nutritional supplements or anything like that, but we can link up lab. So why don't we do that? We'll link up the mold lab and even the Candida lab at stephencabral.com/2657. All right. So regardless if you do the lab testing, regardless if you do mold remediation, regardless if you do a mold protocol, what I want to share with you are foods that if you are someone that's a little bit more sensitive and you might have the stuffy nose, postnasal drip, the itchy eyes, the swollen eyes, the brain fog, you may want to look at these foods. These foods may be exacerbating your histamine levels in general and potentially filling up that rain barrel of more mold. All right, so let's dive right into it. The first one is dried fruit. I'm going to give you which ones are the biggest culprits, and we'll just go from there. So raisins, apricots, prunes, and figs. when dried, can be sitting around for quite some time. The moisture has been basically drawn out, and sometimes a food that's been left out to dry can begin to grow mold. All right, so dried fruit in general is suspect, right? Why? It's an aged food. All right, so I'm gonna take you through this. I have a whole histamine podcast. If you're someone that deals with headaches and skin rashes and brain fog and all those things, please check out my histamine podcast as well. This is something I didn't know about until my later 20s, and I wish I knew about it earlier. I would have gotten better so much faster. All right, so dried fruit is a big one. All right, let's talk about other aged-based fruit. So even if it's not dried, bananas, or other vegetables, anything that's been aged a long time. So a couple brown spots on a banana, it's rated back and forth about which the healthiest bananas are for you, but the TNF, tumor necrosis factor, is highest. Typically when there's that first signs of little brown spots, not big brown spots, but little brown spots all over the banana, that's typically when I then freeze mine. I basically break them up, put them in a bag, and I freeze them, or that's when we'll typically eat them. Now, there's different ways to eat bananas, of course. If you want more of the resistant starch, it's more when it's green, it's lower glycemic, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you. Just be careful of these things that age for a while, right? Really important. We'll get to some of the beverages in just a moment. Aged cheese is another one. So fresh cheese, typically less mold and less issues for people with histamine issues and less mold sensitivity in general. But if it has been aged, and you can actually see the mold on the outside a lot of the times, well, it's going to be more of a moldy food. Mushrooms is in that same category. All right. Mushrooms are a fungi, right? Well, they are not mold or resistant to mold in general. They can be considered a mold. They can be considered at least a cousin to mold. So basically we have yeast, we have fungi, and we have mold. And they're all, let's say, cousins, right? They're very, very closely related. And so what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that mushrooms are bad for you. What I'm saying is that mushroom coffees, mushroom teas, mushrooms in general can be an issue for some people with candida overgrowth or mold overgrowth. Same goes, again, for aging-based foods. What about leftovers? I don't do a lot of leftovers. Funny that I say that now because I was actually just posting on Instagram some salmon, some broccoli, and some rice. I would typically never have salmon the next day because it's much higher in histamines. But again, in general, when the food sits, it can be, especially if there's a little bit of moisture in that refrigerator, it can start to build up more mold. And while I'm on the same topic, it's one of the reasons why we typically tell people not to put their supplements in the refrigerator. Besides maybe an omega-3, even though you can keep your omega-3 out of the refrigerator if it's a small bottle, it's really okay. But in general, we don't put coffee in the refrigerator. You don't put your coffee grinds in there. Because again, if there's that little bit of moisture, then it's going to be much more prone to growing mold. So just keep those in mind. In general, a lot of grains, believe it or not, it's one of the most common ways to get mold outside of a water-damaged home is different grains. When the grains are packaged, there's typically nothing wrong with them. They're honestly like, let's say you get oats. Okay, no issue. But the problem is the oats can get a little damp, right? There can be a little humidity in the air in the manufacturer. And then they're put in a bag. Or, typically in a bag, right? And so they can then start to grow a little bit of mold. And so it's important to look at that. And again, does not mean that these foods are unhealthy. What it means is that someone who's recovering from mold may want to be careful with these particular foods. And so what I would say is there's a lot of companies that tell you if they test for mold, right? So like for Equalife's nutritional supplements, they're tested for mold, most of them. And when you look at oats, you can actually find companies that test for mold. And so if you're sensitive to mold and you still want to have oats, you can look for that particular company that does test for it, all right? I typically will not name all of the companies because you could be listening to this podcast many years in the future. Maybe they're doing it, maybe they're not. And so you can always do a lookup on that. But just keep in mind, same with bread. Breads can get moldy quickly. So it's really important that we don't eat a lot of these preservative-based breads, but also that at the same time, if you are eating a bread that it's fresh, it's not really out there for multiple days. Okay, this is one that's going to surprise a lot of people, but tomato sauce or ketchup. And I would say it's more with ketchup than it is with tomato sauce because tomato sauce is typically jarred at a lower pH to prevent a lot of that mold. But once it's been opened, you can absolutely get mold in tomato sauce. There's no doubt about that. But ketchup is another one too. So we have to be just careful because it can also come from moldy tomatoes. So remember, a lot of the tomatoes that are not possible for sale because they're smashed, they're not, beautiful looking tomatoes, or they've gone moldy, well, they go into cheap forms of ketchup. So just, again, keep that in mind. All right, a few other ones would be, honestly, hamburger meat. It's kind of the same thing as old tomatoes. It's kind of gross to think about. But oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the worst meat that's not able to be sold gets made into burger. And that's a problem. So what you want to do is, especially if you're getting meat, is that you're purchasing it basically frozen, like because it's made, you basically slaughter the animal, then it's going to immediately be frozen. And if not, is it irradiated or irradiated? What are they doing to keep that more natural color? Because it's going to start to rot. It's going to start to get moldy. And so it's something to think about. Sometimes, believe it or not, the fresh frozen-based food can oftentimes be a little bit healthier for you. Not always. Again, if you can get it fresh, then hey, even better. But it definitely goes for fish as well. Excuse me. If you're not getting fresh fish, it's better to get frozen. It really is. You do not want a fish loaded with high levels of histamines and that's starting to produce a lot more. You're not going to get as much mold from fish, but you certainly can, like once it's been out for a while. It's going to rot, that's for sure. Okay, processed meats, same salamis and hot dogs and those types of things can be made, and typically are, from the worst possible meats. And then they're used with preservatives, but again, they're aged, and that aging process can oftentimes grow mold on the outside. Couple beverages, beer, that's one, can be moldy, absolutely. And typically it's said that the darker the brew of beer, the more mold that can begin to grow. Wine, of course, I mean, the older the wine, the more aged that it is, especially if there was any like gap in the cork in the bottle, will absolutely be a little bit more moldy, and that's mainly your red wines. Your white wines are typically going to be a little less moldy. They're going to contain less histamines as well. The darker the wine, for the most part, the darker the red wine, the more histamines they're likely to produce too. Some of that has to do with sulfates, some of it has to do with tannins, but certainly in aged wine, especially if there was an air gap, can start to, deteriorate the wine, but also grow mold. And you'll sometimes see it on the cork. Ideally, you don't see it on the cork for sure, but that can be a sign that the whole wine has been contaminated. So these are a few that we tend to give our clients and make them aware of if they ever do a mold protocol. It does not mean they need to eliminate all of these foods, but the truth is you have all of your fresh fruit still. You have all of your fresh veggies or frozen vegetables, frozen fruit. You have basically all clean, fresh meat, egg-based products that you would like if you want to use those. And you have mold-tested grains if you're into grains and you use some of those. So it's not that you can't choose from every food group. You absolutely can, but you want to be careful of the same basic foods that may also be prone to histamine levels, which are aged foods, smoked foods, which is just a form of age in it so that it preserves it longer, and then also spices. So spices is an important one too. If the spices get any moisture in them, that's why we don't keep them in the fridge, right? If the spices get any moisture in them, those spices can tend to grow a little bit of mold as well. Now, the nice thing is, some spices are actually antifungal, like cloves, oregano, thyme. So those ones you don't have to worry about as much. That's why they work so great too during mold-based protocols or candida yeast-based protocols. So hopefully today's show was helpful. All the show notes today will be at stevencabral.com/2657. Take care, everybody. And as always, if the show was helpful, do feel free to share it with anyone you believe it could serve. Thanks so much for tuning into today's show. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I want to make sure that you're getting our daily content, not missing out on anything. Functional medicine, wellness, weight gain, weight loss, anti-aging, living longer, stronger, and all of the most cutting-edge research. And if there's any topics you want to hear, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Take care.